Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas. Good morning and welcome back to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast of politics, culture, and ideas. I'm Nick Dyrenfurth, head honcho, Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre, joined once again by my co-conspirator, Australia's leading pollster, Kos Samaras. Good morning, Kos.
Good morning, sir.
We've got a cracking guest today. We are joined by one of Australia's foremost political journalists and historians, Paul Kelly, to discuss his latest book, The Twilight of Exceptionalism. The book concludes Paul's trilogy on contemporary Australian politics and examines successively the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments, but its ambition is much, much larger. It's a large book, Kos. Paul argues that Australia has entered a new historical era marked by slower economic growth, declining institutional trust, cultural fragmentation, technological disruption, and a political system which is struggling to undertake and pursue reform. We'll be discussing Paul's book and much more, because Paul Kelly is editor-at-large of The Australian and one of Australia's most political commentators. He has spent 5 decades in and about the Canberra Press Gallery and has chronicled every Prime Minister from Gough, Whitlam onwards and Fraser onwards, and authored numerous landmark works, including The End of Certainty, Howard's Decade, Triumph and Demise, Morris, and now The Twilight of Exceptionalism. We're exceptionally fortunate to have Paul Kelly in the studio. Professor Kelly, welcome to Curtin's Cast.
Very good to be with you, Nick.
Your title is striking, Paul. I was delighted to write an endorsement of this magnum opus. What exactly was the Australian exceptionalism? When and how did we lose it?
Australian exceptionalism was the story of an extraordinary, successful period of Australian governance, really started by the Hawke government under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, extended then by John Howard and Peter Costello. This was when Australia became a world leader in terms of economic and social reform. We were outstanding as measured by OECD countries. We were outstanding in terms of the economic and social indicators. Our per capita income rose ahead of the United States. We were a world leader in terms of globalised discussion about economic and social reform. What I argue in the book is that period conducted by governments of both the Labor Party and the Coalition has now passed into history. And essentially, the idea of Australian exceptionalism is now lost. The idea that Australia can be a world leader is now lost. We are heading into a very difficult period in which governments struggle to deliver national interest policies based in terms of social and economic reform. We see the sense of decline in terms of stagnant living standards, in terms of weak productivity, in terms of substantial budget deficits. The electorate is unhappy, it's restless, it knows that something is wrong, and our leaders are failing to deliver first best national interest policy.
It's a really good summary. I would say that it's probably a manifestation also of most of the individuals that we see in government today or in opposition today worked for those governments or were around and probably took all the wrong lessons out of working for those governments, those particular exceptional politicians, whether it's Howard, Hawke, Keating and so on. And I think, that coupled with, would you agree, Paul, that the complete fragmentation of that is the stability these governments provided. So we saw that commence with Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, and into Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, so many prime ministers in a decade. I think that is probably a manifestation of what you just talked about as well.
I think this is completely correct. And what I argue in the book is that Australia is a more fragmented nation now. The divisions in this country at grassroots level are quite alarming in terms of values, in terms of generation, in terms of rural Australia versus urban Australia. We are a much more divided polity. And when you've got divisions like this, when you've got a fractured country like this, it's not surprising that you'll get fractured governments. And that's what we've seen. We saw initially the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd period, and then we saw, in a sense, a more substantial disruption at government level in terms of the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison period, that 9 years, when we saw 3 different Liberal prime ministers, each running through a different parliamentary term. But the point about these 3 prime ministers is they were completely different people. They were different in terms of temperament, outlook, character. They had different views as to what the Liberal Party should be about. They had different views about what Australia was about. And so it's hardly surprising that after that 9-year period, the electorate, when we went to the 2022 election, the electorate turned savagely against the Liberal Party and the coalition. That's not a surprise. The electorate was confused about what the Liberal Party stood for. They were confused about the core beliefs of the Liberal Party, and I think that confusion remains there today.
Paul, you're arguing this is this is an economic story. It's a political story. It's a cultural story. And you've identified an Australian exceptionalism and the twilight of that exceptionalism. But I have to say, I was in the audience on Saturday night amongst the Labor's true believers, and I listened intently and carefully to the Prime Minister's speech, and he made the observation, it was a boastful observation, that he has now, as Prime Minister, seen 5 British Prime Ministers. So, I think this is a broader story across the West and the Anglo-American democracies, this flux and this disruption.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, Australia's not unique here. We've seen, if we just look at the United Kingdom and America, clearly there's been a tremendous sense of political upheaval in those countries, of a different dimension, of course. I think if we look at Anthony Albanese in this country, he's solved one problem, and he needs credit for that, and that is stability. He really prizes stability, and essentially what's happened, I think, this is a very important point, the Labor Party, after it won in 2022, decided above all else there must be no repeat of the leadership instability and the factional warfare that accompanied the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd period. Now, Labor has been true to that. And Anthony Albanese, and we saw this at the most recent national conference, Anthony Albanese is leading a government in which he, as Prime Minister, has enormous authority, and this government is marked by remarkable unity. I mean, it's now in its 4th year. There is a tremendous sense of discipline and unity and collective purpose if you look at the cabinet. Now, these are very, very significant achievements. But I would make another point. While we live in a Labor ascendancy, the fundamental question is, are the policies working? Are the economic and social policies of Anthony Albanese working? We know the Labor primary vote is a relatively low primary vote. And I think now, if we look at the economic outlook for the next 12 months, there are some really alarming signs for the Labor Party. And those alarming signs are there are now serious doubts whether the Labor economic model is actually working. And this is an economic model based on much higher spending, government intervention, strong support for the union movement, strong support for renewable energy, very high levels of debt and deficit. And essentially what we've got now off the back of weak productivity, we've now got a fundamental question about living standards in this country. So the big issue facing Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers over the course of the next 18 months leading to the next election is, will their economic policies actually work or not?
And you could see in the productivity numbers when it comes to disposable income, since 2022, the outer suburbs and regions, that is Australians living in those obviously localities, have taken a massive hit in their disposable income. And the only parts of the country that are actually prospering are the inner parts of our large cities. And I think that's what's feeding also the political fragmentation out there. There's a lot of Australians who clearly would tell us in the research space that they actually feel it. They see that they've actually experienced significant decline in living standards. And for many of them, they've never experienced anything like it. They've never lived through a recession, for example. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that in the polls.
Well, what I'd like to ask you then, Kos, sort of given the extent of fragmentation, given the extent to which the public is worried and concerned about living standards, how might this play out in terms of support for the Albanese government at the next election? But in particular, does the rise of One Nation and the disruption that One Nation represents create a degree of political exemption from harm for Anthony Albanese?
Yeah, to a certain extent. They can contain the One Nation problem in particular geographies, and they can get away with that. So if you look at where his government is vulnerable to One Nation, it's in places like the Hunter. It's in regional localities and some outer suburban localities as well. But overall, they don't have the same existential threat that the coalition does, and so therefore they can govern with the knowledge they can get to 75, 70, 76 seats if they are able to cobble together enough of an electoral coalition to get them across the line. The problem in all this, though, is that if the economic circumstances for a lot of younger Australians does not improve, that fragmentation will start to occur on their left flank, and that is their biggest danger. It has not manifested yet because I don't think the Greens are the vehicle for that, but we are picking up enormous levels of anxiety and distress amongst younger Australians that I think older Australians are now beginning to express through their voting intention. It just hasn't manifested with younger ones yet.
It just seems to me that the Greens are remarkably unsuccessful at the moment because the Greens should be exploiting this dissatisfaction on the left. We look at what's happening in the US and the UK.
That's right.
We see the rise of a really strong left wing, and you can see it rising in this country, but it's not translating into votes for the Greens.
Yeah, that's right.
Kos, you've tracked this all the way back to October 7.
Yes.
The Greens were not ascendant, but there was a slow march towards a primary of between 15 and 20%, and October 7 hit, and the fundamental point is they mistook their activist base for the broader sort of progressive constituency that they were eating into of Labor's.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about before the podcast, and that is the political class, whether it's people in the Greens, whether it's Pauline Hanson herself or some on the Labor camp, really do misdiagnose why they attract certain Australians to them. The online algorithm has a big role in that. And I think in this case, it also applies to the Greens. They clearly thought that that's where all the growth was going to be for them if they doubled down on their response to the crisis in Gaza. And they put off a lot of young progressives. And these younger progressives now
who are having starting families and having young children.
That's right.
It's the older millennials is where they really lost.
Correct.
They really lost out.
Adam Bandt lost his seat off the back of that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Paul, just going back to we're talking about the existential crisis on the non-Labor side of politics. Where does it begin? You talk about very much a convergence of five great transitions. The great transition around technology, geopolitics, social values, energy, economics. Was any Australian government realistically capable of managing all of these simultaneously, or were successively Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison destined to disappoint?
I think whoever had been governing during this most recent period, the period I've written about, 2013 to 22, whoever had been governing would have found the challenges very severe at that time. I say in the book that even successful prime ministers such as Bob Hawke and John Howard, if you were able to transpose them into that period, they would have found governing much more difficult, and they would have found reform much more difficult still. So I want to emphasise that particular point because I think it's an important point. And in the introduction to the book, I put forward what I think in many ways is the essential conundrum of the period, where I say, looking at the challenges that governments faced, I think the defining problem was that we had governments of diminished political capability not able to sufficiently address the magnitude of the new challenges. I think that is the essence of the Australian problem, and I think it still exists. Now, you identified those challenges. I think they're really important. The economic challenge is much greater than before because it's tied into structural factors. We've then got the energy transition with all the tribulations that represents. We then have the cultural fragmentation and divisions arising from identity politics. We have the technological revolution, the rise of social media, the decline of the legacy media, and then, of course, we have the great strategic challenge from the rise of China. Now, any one of these challenges is pretty significant. When you put the lot together, you can see that governments during this period and governments today are facing really awesome difficulties, and it's not surprising that they are struggling, and it's not surprising in some senses that they are failing. But I think that is the Australian story at the moment, and the fundamental question is, how do we get out of this?
It's a big question. But I do think we need to understand how we got into this mess in the first place. And you take a very close look at Abbott, Turnbull, and Morrison. You argue that each failed for different reasons. So perhaps if I could get you to finish each of these sentences. Abbott failed because X, Turnbull failed because Y, Morrison failed because Z.
I think it's a really important question, and you're right. What I argue in the book is that despite their achievements, and I don't overlook the achievements of these three prime ministers, but at the end of the day, I think they all finished up as disappointing prime ministers, and that's because each failed in their own particular way. When it comes to Tony Abbott, I think there was a conflict right from the start in his prime ministership after his 2013 election victory. While it's true that the public voted for him strongly at that election, they didn't vote for Abbott's brand of conservatism. Mm-hmm. The country was actually becoming more progressive. So right from the start, there was going to be a tension between Abbott's conservatism and a progressive country. And one of the issues was, well, how was that tension going to be resolved? Well, it was resolved with the Parliamentary Party removing Abbott after 2 years. So I think that's the essence of the Abbott story. What happened then was Malcolm Turnbull became Liberal leader and Prime Minister. Well, Turnbull is the most well-known progressive that the Liberal Party's ever produced in terms of leadership. And Turnbull's problem, of course, was while he became Prime Minister, the magnitude of his victory over Abbott was quite narrow, and Turnbull led a divided party. After his very narrow 2016 election victory, where he was reduced effectively to a majority of one, Turnbull was in a very difficult position, facing an aggressive Labor Party on the other side of the chamber and an aggressive Conservative lobby behind him, with Tony Abbott still in the Parliament, who were keen to replace him. So in that sense, Turnbull was never able to unite the Liberal Party, and he was never able to operate after that 2016 narrow election victory. He was never able to operate as a Prime Minister of real authority. So that was Turnbull's problem. Scott Morrison became the third Prime Minister. Now, the point to make about Scott Morrison is he is famous initially because he won the 2019 election. That meant this period of coalition government became a three-term government, not a two-term government. I do argue in the book that only Morrison could have won the 2019 election, that neither Malcolm Turnbull nor Peter Dutton would have won that election. Morrison was a transactional centrist. For a long time, he was performing very well right through 2020, but eventually he was brought undone as a result of his own mistakes and then the health consequences from COVID, and the campaigns against him further weakened him. So at the end of the day, Morrison failed. He was a very unpopular Prime Minister at the 2022 election, but it wasn't just about him. He carried the collective baggage from the 9 years of disappointing coalition government.
I think you strike a bit of a chord here, I think, with the idea that, for example, Abbott took the wrong lessons out of his victory and didn't realise he was living in a very different country to the one he imagined he was becoming Prime Minister with. And then also you look at Scott Morrison's victory in 2019, again, the wrong diagnosis. It seems it's becoming a trend across both sides of politics where they take the wrong lessons out of electoral victories and ignore the challenges the country's facing that you've articulated really well in the book, but also just now. And that is, instead of actually understanding that the remedy to your challenges is actually embracing real structural reform that's needed in this country, not dwelling on why you won back 2 years ago, for example.
I think this is so important. I mean, in my sort of long period covering politics, I think one of the mistakes successful prime ministers make is they misinterpret their most recent election victory. And of course, they tend to exaggerate their own ability and their own capacity and think that the victory is tied up with their own personality rather than having a more concerted analysis about what was going on with the country. Now, just to take one example off the back of what you've just mentioned, I think Tony Abbott's victory in 2013, look, they thought it was going to be business as usual. They thought the coalition is back in government after just a short period of Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. They underestimated how much Australia had changed. They thought that it was just going to be an update under Tony Abbott of the Howard ascendancy. And in that sense, I think they really misunderstood the challenges of the country. The great example of this was the first budget.
Yes.
The 2014 Abbott hockey budget. Now, they hadn't prepared the country for such tough economic medicine. But the point is, the country didn't expect such tough economic medicine. The country thought, oh, we've got a new Liberal government. This will be good. The economy will improve. Living conditions will improve. And suddenly, with the first budget, they're hit with this very tough, assertive budget, which is cutting back a lot of benefits. And the country wasn't ready for it, but something else happened. The country rejected it. The country was not interested in this harsh fiscal medicine anymore. And Abbott and Hockey misread where the country was and what the mood of the country was.
Why weren't they ready for it? I mean, I would probably... You place a great emphasis on cultural change in your book, and you're arguing that Australia's become more progressive. I mean, it might surprise you that I still think that the great centre of Australian politics is actually quite small c conservative, and that's where I think on one hand, Abbott, it's big C conservatism was jarring, and on the other hand, you had Turnbull's shiny liberal progressivism, which also don't think sat well with that mainstream small C conservative, which is I think that sensible part of the electorate is quite fine with sensible sort of progressive social change.
Happy to talk about this whole debate about conservatism and progressivism. I think there's a lot in that.
Kos mightn't be too happy,
but I think the actual explanation in terms of the question you asked about why wasn't the country ready for the 2014 budget, I think the explanation is essentially economic. And I think there are two dimensions to this. We'd become a very complacent country. We were an incredibly rich country. In this period from the decade after 2003, given the commodities boom, the fantastic increase in trade with China, the surge in national income was simply enormous. We became a really rich country, a very fortunate country, a very lucky country. And so that good fortune meant people just weren't ready for harsh economic medicine at all. I think the country had become quite complacent, and it had forgotten that a lot of economic progress has got to be delivered through tough decisions relating to productivity. That is, you've got to invest in order to get outcomes. And I don't think that's where the country was at all. So I think that's an important factor. The other important factor is that Abbott and Hockey did not prepare the country for this budget. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. They were mesmerised, I can tell you, they were mesmerised by the Howard Costello first budget in 1996, when Howard and Costello brought down a relatively tough budget, and it was a great political success. So Abbott and Hockey looked at this and thought, we are going to replicate what John and Peter did. But again, the country was a different country, so they got that wrong.
And also, what John and Peter did was build the case for it. Right?
They certainly did.
This is it. So that I would say Hawke, Keating, John Howard, Peter Costello were masters at building a case for reform. They took a while. They prepared the electorate. They ran a narrative for some time before they introduced certain measures. The GST is a really good example of that, right? Where he even took it to the electorate. I think that, Joe Hockey and Abbott, like many of their own contemporaries, whether either on the Labor side, tend to fail to build a case for their policies.
This is so true. I can remember, I covered it so carefully, the opening weeks of the Howard Costello government, what Peter Costello did as Treasurer in those opening weeks, he put on the table where the deficit was. He argued immediately that the public had been misled, that the fiscal position was much, much worse than Labor had been prepared to concede. He rammed this message through. Howard and Costello campaigned on this for about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And right from the start, Costello argued that there had to be fundamental economic changes, fundamental structural changes, and they got that message up.
That's right.
How much of that, though, is a failure of leadership? And one of the critiques I have of the first 6 months of the Labor government is exactly that. They didn't actually, I think Treasurer Chalmers has done many good things, but there wasn't a bracingly honest conversation with the Australian public about the deep-seated structural problems in the economy, and there's a sense that they missed the chance in the second half of 2022 to take significant decisions on spending and structural reform, and they've become bold at certain points in the political cycle. But how much of it, Paul, is also, we're laying the blame at the mainstream so-called legacy political parties and the current cohort of leaders or recent generations of leaders. But how much of it is on the Australian public in terms of embracing an appetite for reform and backing in our prime ministers?
Okay, well, I think there is a problem with the Australian public, and I think there is a problem with public opinion, and the fact that it's a more fragmented country exacerbates that, and that's a big issue which does need to be addressed. But I want to go to your initial question about why didn't Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers come in and seek a decisive break from the past and introduce bolder policies? The answer to that question is they didn't want to do it, and they didn't want to do it for very good reasons. And this goes back to the approach that Albanese took as opposition leader after the 2019 election when Bill Shorten had been defeated. The Labor Party at that point was extremely vulnerable. It was demoralised. It was shocked. It had expected to win the 2019 election. That hadn't happened. Albanese became leader and he faced a very daunting challenge. And what he did was he took two strategic decisions. The first one was Labor had to be united, that he had to repair the divisions and he had to run a united Labor Party leading up to the next election in 2022. The second decision he took was he would not give Scott Morrison at the next election any chance to run a scare campaign, any chance to repeat Morrison's 2019 election victory by exploiting the Labor agenda from opposition. So Albanese devised a quite cautious agenda, an economic policy agenda in conjunction with Jim Chalmers, which was very practical, which was designed to ensure there were no losers, designed to ensure that no one was really hurt, designed to appeal to the Australian people saying, we're concerned about your living standards, we're practical people in the Labor Party, we are not radicals. When I interviewed Albanese for the book, Albanese said to me, radical agendas in Australia don't win elections. A really revealing comment. And so essentially he went to the 2022 election campaign determined not to be a radical, not to have a radical agenda. After he won, then obviously he wanted to continue the same cautious approach. The fact that he had a narrow majority was quite important. So as far as the Prime Minister and the incoming Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, were concerned, they didn't want to do anything radical and establish a fundamental break with the past. They were going to be moderate governors without upsetting the Australian people or doing anything radical. What we've seen since then, of course, in the second term, Albanese has recognised, witnessed the most recent budget, that he had to get onto the front foot and do a few more things, and that's happened.
Yeah, they've clearly have realised that the public knows something's wrong and are starving for reform. They, in our research tell us constantly they're sick of the Band-Aids, little handouts here and there. They think it's actually bad policy. And so they're trying to fill that void, but I think it's a lot harder than I think they appreciate.
There are a lot of echoes here, Paul, with Donald Horne's excoriating appraisal of Australia in the 1960s. The Lucky Country, of course, came out in 1964, and Horne used the term ironically, that Australia was a lucky country run by second-rate people who share its luck. I'll put my Labor partisan lens on here. It took Gough Whitlam and many who you wrote about at close hand. Stephen loosely uses this lovely phrase. Gough dragged Australia into the 1960s in the 1970s. Is it a matter then that Horne's thesis has been proven true again and we've run out of luck?
Look, I love the Lucky Country and I like Donald Horne enormously as a person. He was always this tremendous fount of ideas. Every time you caught up with Donald, he's just spitting out ideas at you. So I did enjoy the book. I guess the question you've asked is a really fascinating question, but I resist the idea that the current situation we're in is another replay of Donald's thesis in terms of the Lucky Country. I think that we are a much more sophisticated country now, and we've been through this phase post-Donald Horne, post the Lucky Country, this phase of Australian exceptionalism, in which we did become world leaders. Now, Donald never foresaw that. He never foresaw that. And what that period proved, in terms of both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, we could actually produce pretty significant leaders who were able to do an outstanding job, given the frailties of politics. They did do an outstanding job. And so, yes, I do argue that there's been a decline in leadership talent since then. This is not just a decline in politics, though. It's a decline in the Australian establishment, I think, whether we're talking now about the corporate sector, the university sector, a lot of the not-for-profit sector. I do think there's been a disappointing period when the Australian establishment, when Australian leadership hasn't been as good as it should have been. But I think, given our historical experience, we do have the knowledge within ourselves. We do have the intellectual record there. We've been successful in the past. We know we can be successful. And while this most recent period has been a disappointing period for Australia, I think that we didn't get into the same mess that countries like America and Britain got into. America with the whole Trump phenomenon, which has been a real crisis for the United States as far as I'm concerned. And then you look at the UK. I mean, the situation in the UK today is much, much worse than the situation in Australia. So while we've had a disappointing period in relative terms compared to other countries, and while it's been disappointing in historical terms, I still think it's not as bad. It's not as bad as a few other countries, in particular the two great democracies we like to compare ourselves with, America and Britain.
As someone who knew Donald Horne, you've been in and around the press gallery for 5 decades. What's your sense of the quality of public debate? We've talked a lot about leaders, but the fourth estate has changed dramatically. We've had the rise of social media, and one does wonder. You hinted this earlier. How would a Hawke or a Keating or a Howard, how would they have dealt with the 24-hour news cycle and the fragmentation, the almost collapse of so-called legacy media, the fragmentation, and the fact that, as Kos has pointed out, we used to occupy a shared civic culture and public square. People read the same newspapers in the morning. So the political parties and leaders and campaign operatives were able to look at, winning the morning papers. There used to be afternoon papers as well. I'm old enough to remember that. Or winning the nightly news, where people either watched the ABC or watched the conservative stations 7, 9 and 10. But we know that 70% of Australians are not consuming mainstream media.
This is so true. When John Howard launched my book in Sydney a fortnight ago, one of the things he said, he talked about the rise of social media. It was a very, very honest statement. He said, look, I don't know how I'd go as Prime Minister today having to deal with social media. He just put that up there and saying, I just frankly don't know whether I'd be able to manage it. I don't know how I'd go. Really interesting comment. Now, in the book, one of the chapters is the chapter about the crisis of the political system and the difficulty we have now in producing national interest policy out of governments. And I take 2 examples from the past. The 2 examples I take are the Paul Keating Banana Republic example and the John Howard GST reform from the 1998 election. Now, I take these 2 examples because they are defining elements in the Hawke-Keating period and then in the Howard period. Now, what I say is, in today's media, if Keating had done the Banana Republic exercise, it would not have succeeded, that the media would have turned on Keating. They would have asked Keating when he was going to resign, having declared such a fiasco, having declared that Australia was facing a banana republic, and that they would not have supported all the subsequent economic reforms from Keating. Whereas what happened back in the 1980s was most of the press gallery supported Keating's reforms, and they supported the spirit of the Banana Republic comments, thinking that this had to be a wake-up call for Australia. So rather than condemn Keating for admitting the magnitude of this challenge, they actually supported his reforms. And I'm very sceptical about whether that would happen today. In relation to Howard, what I say about Howard is, okay, Howard won the 1998 election, taking to the election this very significant GST tax reform, which we know in its own right was unpopular. And what I say about that is, today, Howard would not get away from that. If we transposed Howard to the current age and imagine John Howard taking a GST tax reform to the people, I argue there's no way Howard would win the election today. The campaign against him would be ferocious, the social media campaign would be absolutely deadly, and there's no way Howard today would have been able to persuade the Australian people to accept the tax reform the way he did prevail in 1998. So to go to your point, Nick, what I'm arguing is the media has changed fundamentally, and I think we've seen a dumbing down of the media debate in this country. I mean, I'm very depressed about the quality of discussion of politics and public policy, and I've used these two examples. Now, a lot of people will disagree with what I've argued, but I use these two examples to make my case that we've seen a dumbing down in political debate since then.
I think this entire generation of politician that we're talking about, from Hawke all the way through to John Howard, even to today's Prime Minister Albanese, they are all the children of the TV era. So, the famous Nixon JFK debate where JFK captured this new medium, which changed the way politicians spoke to the public. I think we've not seen yet a political person or political operative from either side of politics or anywhere who's properly captured how to actually operate in this new medium. That's, I think, really challenging for them all at the moment.
Yes, I read a really depressing, there's a terrific long essay in the most recent Atlantic, Paul, written by Rose Horowitz. She argues we live in the post-literate age. People don't read books, unfortunately. I hope your book sells like hotcakes, Paul, but that's part of the broader cultural problem, cultural malaise.
Well, I hope we've still got a few people who can read the book. Look, I've said to people, it is a long book. You don't have to read it all. It's not compulsory. Each chapter is a standalone chapter, so you can read each chapter in its own right.
But we will, and I have, and it's a fantastic read. Listen, there's an elephant in the room we haven't discussed today. That's One Nation. Paul, you've written caustically about this populist right juggernaut. Are you inclined to agree with Kos that we have perhaps seen the ceiling on One Nation? And where do you see this sort of existential crisis on the non-Labor or conservative side of politics? Where do you see that ending up playing out?
I think what we're seeing at the moment is a profound cultural crisis of the entire centre-right, not just with the Liberal and National parties, but the broader sense of the spectrum which has supported the centre-right for a long period of time, whether we're talking now about corporates, whether we're talking about institutional supporters of the centre-right, whether we're talking about the broader centre-right media, which has supported the coalition for a long period of time. I think this whole spectrum of the centre-right is now in a degree of intellectual and political crisis. They are thoroughly confused about what conservatism is, about what liberalism is, and about how a centre-right political party should in fact behave. And clearly, I think off the back of this disappointing period of government, 2013 to 22, and then the disastrous Peter Dutton-led experience of the coalition at the 2025 election, you can see that this sense of crisis is really profound. Out of this, we've seen the rise of Pauline Hanson's One Nation. I will confess, I was taken by surprise at the degree of public opinion support that Hanson's got in the mid-20s, the high 20s, up to 30%. I mean, I never saw this coming. I never anticipated it. I think most people didn't see it coming. Has Hanson reached a ceiling? Well, we don't know. I wouldn't make a firm prediction, but my instinct is to tell me she probably has reached a ceiling, and I think she will come off. How far she comes off, I don't know. But I still think even if she came off quite a lot, just take a speculative number, just say at the next election she'd come off to 12, 13, 14%, which would be a very significant fall from where she is now. But that would still be an incredible disruption for the centre-right at the next election. That would still be a really crippling situation for One Nation in terms of undermining the coalition at the next election. So I'm inclined to think that what we might be seeing is we might be seeing some longer-term enduring change in the nature of the centre-right, which is hard to describe what that change is. But I really think that the Hanson legacy is going to have some sort of enduring impact.
It would seem that way, and there's an argument that we're seeing a phenomenon similar to the way the DLP split the Labor vote across the 1950s and 1960s. Now, did it put bums on seats in Parliament? No, but did it gruel the hopes of two Labor leaders who could well have become Prime Minister, and Doc Evatt and Arthur Calwell? Both
problems is a manifestation of identity. Both political parties back then in the 50s had an identity crisis within the Labor camp, and now we've got with the centre-right.
I think this is exactly correct. Exactly correct. It goes, and I mean, identity is pretty serious. If you've got a problem about identity, you've got a really serious problem. So I think this is right. You can see support for Hanson goes to the question of Liberal Party and coalition identity. But look, there's a bizarre aspect to all this. When you listen to people who are voting for One Nation, and when you talk to them, and when you look at the polling results, these people hate the Albanese government. They really detest the Albanese government. And they actually think that voting for One Nation is the best way of removing the Albanese government. Now, of course, some of them just want to burn the place down. I know. But there's a certain group who labour under the misapprehension that supporting Pauline Hanson is the best way to remove Anthony Albanese. Well, this is just absurd. Of course it's not. And the Labor apparatchiks and the Labor analysts know that the rise of Hanson is going to help Labor at the next election. So this is an extraordinary cultural misapprehension which is underway in this country on the centre-right.
Really good example of that is if you look at the One Nation vote versus Labor, two-party preferred vote. Labor's two-party preferred vote amongst Australians who speak a language other than English at home versus One Nation is in excess of 70%. That same group drops down to 55 if it's a Liberal contest. There's your illustration. Yeah.
The flip side, Paul, of course, and we saw it on display at the May 2025 federal election, what we might call the broad, the centre-left progressive electorate was labouring under no mistake about the proposition in 2025, and that if they wanted to keep Peter Dutton out, then the choice was to vote for Labor, not the Greens. And we're now seeing the reverse, where you've identified there's a block in the centre-right electorate who have adopted the contrary position.
I think this is exactly correct, and this has been developing for quite some time. Howard, when he was Prime Minister, was always alert to the risk of breakaways to the right. And if you look at the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison period, during that period, we saw an increase in fragmentation to the right, away from the coalition vote. And I think from memory, if you look at the 2022 election, in terms of the primary vote, I think Hanson had about 4% and other right-wing breakaways had about 4 or 4.5%. So you actually had about 8 or 9 or 10% of a right-wing vote, which was for smaller parties breaking away from the coalition. So this has always been a problem. Well, certainly it's been a problem over the last generation. And of course, it got much worse after the 2025 election defeat for Peter Dutton. And I understand the sentiment because remember the polls in late 2024. There was this, I think, misinterpretation for a lot of people. They were really starting to think, given the polls looked reasonably competitive, that Peter Dutton might actually win the election, or if he didn't win the election, he might force Anthony Albanese into minority government. And I think on the centre-right, this became a really powerful idea. Now, I never subscribed to this. I always believed that Anthony Albanese would win the election, and I was sceptical about a lot of the polls. But what happened was that a lot of people on the centre-right had extremely high expectations, and then they got this disastrous result where Albanese got this tremendous majority. And so the sense of disillusionment on the centre-right among voters was quite profound. And I can understand people who voted for the coalition at the 2025 election saying, I'm fed up with these people. I don't trust them. I thought they were going to go pretty well at this election, and it's just a fiasco. I'm going to take my vote elsewhere. I think that was a very strong sentiment.
It's a really good diagnosis of exactly what happened. It actually started at the election, that exodus. So if you look at the polling numbers for Dutton, he lost about 5 or 6% of his primary vote to his right flank, and it was Gen X. If you look at the analysis that we've done, it's Gen X that started the roll into right-wing minor parties in the ballot on election night. Yeah,
you and I, because Gen X, the change makers of Australian politics. On generation, on last question, then Paul, on the generational question, my view is Angus Taylor is not the answer. Is it a matter of a generational skip to Andrew Hastie, who potentially confounds ideological expectations? Or is that playing into a messiah complex, and the challenge and the crisis before centre-right politics in this country is much bigger than one individual?
Well, a couple of points. I think you've got to be very careful about getting in this revolving door with leadership changes. And I think you only make a leadership change if there's a really, really overriding, compelling argument. Now, having said that, look, I've got a great view of Andrew Hastie. I admire him very much, but I'm yet to be persuaded that it makes sense for the party to install Andrew as leader at this point in time. I think that would be too early for him. I think there is still some maturity to be required for Andrew in terms of thinking about him as a leader. I recognise the problems with Angus Taylor, in particular the lack of cut-through. Clearly, he's been having trouble creating an impact with the community. But I think for the time being, the party needs to stick with Angus Taylor. He has a very ambitious policy agenda for the Liberals, some of which has been rolled out, but there's a lot more yet to come. I think he understands that the Liberals have got to go bold in terms of policy. They've got to offer a really significant, dramatic alternative to the Labor government. That's where he's coming from. And I think that in general terms is the right strategy. He's got to show that he can roll that out. And in particular, he's got to show that he can try and sell it. But we've got to be very careful, I think, about making a judgment about Angus Taylor at this point in time and deciding that he can't effectively combat One Nation. If we in fact think that the One Nation vote might be coming off a bit, then I think we need to pause and reflect and not make some hasty judgment about the need for a further change in the Liberal leadership at this point in time.
It's a wonderful unintended pun there. This is we are going to draw to a hasty conclusion because we've run out of time. We ran out of time a long time ago. Curtinistas, it's been a privilege hearing from Paul Kelly today. Please go out and prove me wrong about this post-literate age that we live in. Buy The Twilight of Exceptionalism, the Liberal and Conservative Era, which is out through Melbourne University Publishing. It's a tremendous read, long-form political history, gritty interviews with recent prime ministers, and there's something in it for everyone. You have the late, great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks quoted in the introduction. Go out, all good quality bookstores and online. Paul Kelly, thank you very much for joining us on Curtin's Kos Samaras. As always, thank you. Good luck with the national book tour, Paul.
Thank you, Nick. It's been great to talk with both you and Kos. So thank you so much.
But for now, Curtinistas, don't forget, like, subscribe, refer a mate on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. But for now, it's ciao and arrivederci.